Hello, my name's Olurotimi Osha. Today is June the 29th, 2026, and I want to make some clarification in an earlier video, earlier video I made concerning the richest men in America at the time of the Revolutionary War of 1776. I had talked about how in 1775, the richest man in America was Robert Morris from Philadelphia. He was an immigrant, actually born in um, in Liverpool, England, and he came to be known as the financier of the Revolution. And of course, he used his substantial fortune to, to supply the Continental Army. Now, while Robert Morris was the richest man in America in 1775, however, that changed once the Revolutionary War began because the English Navy blockaded, American maritime shipping, and of course, Robert Morris's wealth was in shipping, importing and exporting between British. West Indies and West Indies colonies in the West Indies, in the Caribbean, and of course Britain. So once England blockaded American shipping, his fortune was decimated. Meanwhile, somebody else whose wealth was in enslaved persons, that is Charles Carroll of Maryland. He became the wealthiest man in the colonies with a net worth of 2.1 million pounds in 1776. That's the equivalent of $616 million in today's money. Now his fortune was preserved. He remained the richest man in America after the Revolutionary War, unlike Robert Morris, who went bankrupt, ended up in debtor's prison once he'd made some bad investments in, speculating in land. So you see the significance of wealth and fortune, unfortunately, in the holding of Africans as slaves. And so right now, what I want to do is I want to make the distinction between the use of slave, right, in my language, and enslaved person. So there's nuance, and one, of course, pays more respect, right, and humanizes the African or the person who was forced into slavery, while the other just treats the African as chattel, right? Chattel in the dictionary is defined as an article of movable personal property, and that's what chattel is when they're saying chattel slavery. So, of course, a while back I'd read the distinction between the use of enslaved persons and the use of slave, right? So the language nuance, because I first read this in an article in NPR, and was referring to the Associated Press's style book. As the Associated Press style book recommended the use of enslaved persons as opposed to slave, and of course the New York Times 1619 Project, which was created by the journalist ha- Hannah Nicole Jones. She was also a MacArthur Prize, Genius Prize winner, right? A MacArthur Fellow. So the 1619 Project also and underscored that nuance, the language nuance. Now, so when we're saying language nuance, let me just explain it, right? So when you say enslaved person, right? Enslaved person, the word enslaved, of course, it's an action word. It's showing that something is being done. It's an experience. Enslaved person, enslaved is an experience as opposed to a slave. A slave sort of connotes an inherent state, a being. So there's a difference between enslaved, which is an experience, and slave, which connotes a being, right? An inherent state, an essence, right? When we say enslaved person, it shows the experience of being oppressed, of being abused, of being dehumanized, and it embodies all of that. It projects that notion that slavery is being imposed, and it's not an identity. It's not an inherent identity of the Africans who were being held, despite the fact that the law made slavery permanent through Partus Sequitur Ventrum, which was passed, was it in 1662 in Virginia. Partus Sequitur Ventrum, I've done a video discussing that. That was a law that basically said that the status, right, the slave or free status of the mother passed to her child, to her offspring, and that was what made slavery permanent in America. However, regardless of that law, using the term enslaved persons, still humanizes the African, and it shows that slavery is a form of oppression that dehumanizes him. It's not something that he wants, or a state that he identifies with. The in opposition to the word slave. Slave strips the African, the being, of his identity and his agency. So despite the fact that yes, the enslaved person was dehumanized, and despite the fact that the enslaved person was dehumanized, he was still a human being. He still had agency. He still had his identity. He still had his hopes, his desires, despite the fact that the law treated him as an article, as property, as chattel, right? So the enslaved, the term enslaved person, shows the abuse, the oppression, and the dehumanization, the human rights violation that occurred to the African who was being held here in America, as opposed to slave. Slave just connotes again a state of being, like an inherent state, devoid of identity, just a piece of property. Again, chattel, right? Chattel, like a domestic animal, and so one has to be very careful, because yes, during slavery there was the abuse, there was the dehumanization by the enslaver. Now, enslaver, as opposed to a slave owner. Slave owner seems very transactional, right? It's transactional and void of value judgment or morality. When you say enslaver, it shows again a process of doing something, the doing, right? And in this case, of course, it's violence. It connotes morality, the abuse of another person, right? The force used to subjugate another person, to take another person's humanity. So the enslaver is more active, as opposed to a slaveholder or slave owner, which is merely transactional, like, right? Just like saying a shareholder or stockholder, right? The slave is not. Again, these are persons, right? The slave was not meant to be property, right? Devoid of humanity or agency. So the reason I'm doing this video is um, people who are more informed in, well, you could call it critical race theory, or people who are writers, like I said, the Associated Press style book, NPR, more progressive mainstream media, they're very cognizant of using, of making this language distinction, right? Enslaved person versus the slave, right? Yes, that era, slavery, a lot of voices, agency was lost, but they were still human beings. And it just, when we use the term enslaved person, we're mindful of being respectful, right? We're mindful of being respectful. So many times when I'm talking about, the history, and I'm talking about our founding fathers, and I tend to use, sometimes I slip into using the term slave owner or slaveholder, or I'm saying slave. I'm not intentionally trying to be disrespectful, because it's actually my intent to say, for instance, if I'm writing, I'm more conscious. I say enslaved person, but as I talk, as I do these videos, if you notice, I do it in an informal manner, right? I'm informal, and I'm rather extemporaneous, right? So again, even though it might seem like what I'm doing is well, uh, has been very carefully planned, it's just because I'm used to reading, a lot of schooling, 16 years of education, and continuous learning, continuous reading. It makes it as simple as somebody who's an owner of a bike, just getting on a bike and riding a bike, and it's natural. So sometimes when I slip into using the term slave as opposed to enslaved person, it's not to be dismissive or unmindful of showing some respect to enslaved persons, enslaved Africans who were kidnapped and dehumanized and stripped of their identity, their agency, their humanity. So that's, I just wanted to make that clarification. I thought that was important, because I'm going to do another video and just discuss the biographies of these two people, and just to show you how significant, again, as I said, uh, chattel slavery was to the U.S. economy. We see that one man, Robert Morris, whose wealth wasn't in slave holding, right? He went from being the richest man in America to debtor's jail, as opposed to somebody uh, who preserved his fortune. The base of his fortune was in the ownership of enslaved persons, right? Was the holding of enslaved persons. So, and his wealth was preserved. He he maintained his status as the richest man in America. So, again, but I try to be cognizant of making that distinction of enslaved persons, that, well, these Africans who were held against their will, they were, they had agency, they were, an act was being done upon them. They were victims of an act, and that was enslavement, that was abuse, that was denial of human rights, and victimization and oppression. They were not inherently slaves. They weren't inherently chattel, right? They weren't inherently chattel as like a piece of furniture, an article of clothing is. And that term slave tends to connote that. In any event, I'll do more videos and probably talk about the nuance of language, and I'm going to, in a subsequent video, discuss the individual biographies of Charles Carroll, who was the richest man in America once the Revolutionary War started in 1776, and his predecessor, that was the richest man in America before the Revolutionary War, as of 1775, that is Robert Morris, also known as the financier of the revolution, right? He was the United States superintendent of finance. So that was the predecessor title of Secretary of the Treasury. And as I said in the earlier video, that he was actually George Washington's first choice in being Secretary of the Treasury, but he turned it down and recommended the very able and brilliant younger Alexander Hamilton, who remains the youngest person to ever serve as Secretary of the Treasury. I think he was 34 or maybe even 32. Sometimes there's this 2 year difference gap in Alexander Hamilton's age, because it's suggested that he may have raised his age a little bit in order to be able to enroll as a student at Columbia University. So it's unclear. My name is Olurotimi Osha, and I will keep you posted. Thank you.